Hello everyone, I'm Paul, and this is Paul in the Cloud. Today, we're going to be talking about the server that is going to be used to learn on in the next 6 months. The next 6 months are going to be filled with all kinds of tests, labs, learning, things like that. I covered all of this in my first video. If you haven't seen that yet, you can go up here and watch it. Today's video is going to be going over the parts, the reasons, the method to the madness, the why, the how, everything about why I chose what I did to build this server to learn on. The primary virtual machine that is going to be running on this server is pfSense. It will have a WAN port, which will just be an uplink to my main home router, and then the LAN port, which will go out to a physical switch, which I'll cover later, to give the rest of the hosts in the Homelab connectivity. All of this is going to be built in the Rosewill RSV L4000U chassis. It is, as the name suggests, a 4U chassis. It has 8 3.5-inch drive bays, 3 5.25-inch bays, which one of those will be adapted to fit 4 more SSDs. Onto the motherboard. The motherboard is the Machinist X99 MR9S. I chose this motherboard because it is a 2011 V3, and I can get processors for that pretty cheap, and it has 8 memory slots. According to the listing on eBay, it also has 4 PCIe X16 slots, but on the same listing, it says there's only 2 X16s, a by 4 and a by 1. So once we get it set up, we'll take a look at everything and determine what it really is. For the processor, I went with the Xeon E5 2650 V4. It is a 12-core, 24-thread processor. It is only 2.2 gigahertz, but that is okay because I don't need my virtual machines to have a lot of power. They kind of just need to be there to test network functionality. That being said, some of the VMs will have full ports pass through to them. Some of them will share ports with other VMs. And so really it's a way to learn software-defined networking, not so much to having high-power virtual machines doing a lot of work. The cooler I chose for the CPU is the Thermalright Assassin King 90. Pretty cool name. The reason I chose this is because the reviews on Amazon said that it fit a 2011 V3 socket and it kept their processors cool, so that was good enough for me. I didn't want to go break the bank on a huge copper heatsink and have to worry about fans in the chassis to keep it cool. For the memory, I kept it simple. I chose 8 sticks of 16 gigabyte DDR4 2400 megahertz ECC RAM. Should be plenty enough to divide amongst the VMs, as well as one of the bigger VMs, which I'll talk about in a moment. For the drives, I am using dual 120 gigabyte Patriot Burst SSDs as the boot drives. Installing ProxMox, they're going to be in a RAID 1 for ease of use in the future. In case one of them dies, I don't have to go back and reconfigure ProxMox from scratch. I can just replace that drive and let the parity data rebuild and move on from there. The main drives for this machine will be 6 4 terabyte Seagate Enterprise SAS drives. I chose these drives because they were free. They were decommissioned from my work. They still have life left in them, and they're not going to be running anything production, so if they die, they die. But the important thing, these drives will be passed through to a TrueNAS VM, which will also have a big chunk of that memory that I talked about a second ago. The TrueNAS VM will have all of these drives in a pool, and that pool will be an iSCSI target for the ProxMox host itself. All of the VMs, except for TrueNAS, will be running off of this data store. Hopefully I can get that configured correctly and get it working, and latency won't be too much of an issue with things I talk about here in a minute. For the networking, I chose one Intel i350 T4 PCIe card. It has 4 1 gigabit network ports. I can pass through each one of those individually to a virtual machine, or I can set virtual machines to share multiple ports, which will help me learn software-defined networking. But also, the ports can be passed to the physical switch so that I can do some learning on a physical switch as well. The second adapter, and the reason I'm hoping I don't have to worry about latency, is a Emulex dual port SFP 10 gigabit adapter. One port will be used for the uplink in TrueNAS to the iSCSI target, hopefully. That way it has a 10 gig link, and all the other VMs don't have to kind of fight for that. But I'm not too sure how that's going to work. That's the reason I'm doing it, is so I can learn and have a better understanding. For the third card is going to be a wireless adapter. It is a NetEase, never heard of that before, but I had it in a box somewhere, don't know where it came from, WF2113 300 megabit per second card. My goal with this card is to pass it through to a VM and learn about wireless networking, wireless signals, and be able to actually map out and graph wireless signals in my area to get a better understanding of how Wi-Fi really works. For the drive connectivity, I picked up an HBA. It is an LSI 9211-8i. It came with two cables that broke out into four SATA connectors, which was the SFF 8087 cables. But since my drives are SAS, typical SATA adapters won't work on them. So I had to order a 2-pack with four adapters of the SFF 8087 to SFF 8482 cables. These cables will plug into the SAS drives, and they also have the adapter for SATA power, so I can use the typical ATX power supply. For the graphics, I did not want to put a GPU in this build. I wanted to save one of those PCIe slots for more networking, but the Xeon does not have an iGPU, so I was kind of forced to. For this, I just picked up a simple MSI GT210. It has 1 GB of DDR3, just enough to get ProxMox installed so I can have a display adapter. Once that is installed, I may remove the adapter and put the other network card in. I have another one of those Intel cards, but I might leave it in because if I break ProxMox, I don't want to have to pull it out of the rack, put it back in, pull it out, just to switch the video card every time I need to reinstall. For the power supply, I chose an MSI MPG A850G 80 plus gold 850 watt power supply. I chose this because it has 12 SATA power connections, which is plenty for the drives I'm going to be putting into it, and it leaves room for expansion in the future. Cool thing about this power supply is it also has native PCIe 5.0 power adapter, so if I do later on want to put a nice graphics card in here to tinker with cloud gaming or remote gaming, I have that option. As for the network switch, I went with the MikroTik CRS 326 24G 2S RM. I got this free when it was decommissioned at work, and I feel like it's going to be a great choice for my Homelab to learn on. The reasoning is it has 24 1 gigabit ports and 2 SFP Plus ports, which one of those will be used for the TrueNAS VM. I should also note that this switch can be booted into a router OS, but for the course of this 6-month lab and everything I'm going to be doing, I'm going to leave it in switch mode as pfSense is going to be my router for this. Once I'm done, I may tinker with it in the future, but for now, we're leaving it simple. Let's do a quick, cool little time lapse of the build going together, and then we'll come back with some words on it, and then maybe get ProxMox installed and see how that works. I'll see you guys here in a bit. All right, and here we are 1 week later. In that week, I have had time to tinker, experiment, break, reinstall ProxMox. So the first thing I did before I installed any VMs, before I did anything else, is I enabled IOMMU. That allows me to pass through devices to the virtual machines as if they were actually connected to the virtual machine as a physical device. The reason I did this is so everything can have bare metal access to some of these cards. The LSI, the Wi-Fi, and the Ethernet. Then when I installed the VMs, the first one I installed so that I could have network connectivity, because that was going to be the hardest part of getting this set up for me because I did not know what I was doing, was pfSense. I passed through port 0 and port 1 on the Intel i350T4, one port for WAN, connected to my home router, the other for LAN for the Homelab network. It was easy enough to get the interfaces up and running, as I've done it before, and I've done it before on a virtual machine, so that wasn't too hard. The issue was when I had the interfaces up, I knew they were connected. I connected my home interface to the Homelab interface, on a /30. So 4 usable IPs, 1 network, 1 broadcast, 2 host. That was fine. The issue was when I was trying to ping the first router to the second router, and I could not figure it out. And so I finally was looking at the firewall logs, and I realized I had to enable the rules on both of them, which I did, but then there was still something I was missing and I could not figure it out. Finally, I found the firewall rule that was blocking it. Not so much the rule, but I examined the logs for the system and then the firewall logs, and I found the destination and source network. Once I did an easy allow rule in pfSense, I could send traffic back and forth between the networks, which is what I wanted to do for setup because I have most of the ISOs and things I need to get to my Homelab already on my home network. So that was the easiest way for me instead of doing a flash drive and uploading everything to it. Now, one of the main settings in pfSense that I had to disable was block private networks, because on the second pfSense router, the WAN interface is really just connected to another router, so it thought that was private traffic trying to come in, when it was really just from my other router. I don't know the complete details of what I did there, but I do know that basically it allows the 10.10.0 network that I have, the /30, to send packets over. So that was resolved. The second weird issue I had is whenever I would make a change on my second pfSense router after that was configured, it would knock out my first router completely. Well, I shouldn't say completely. The LAN interface was still fine. WAN was down. Now, there was a setting that I could configure on my first one that would turn the WAN interface back on. By default, if the WAN interface gets knocked out, pfSense does not re-enable it. So even if it was losing for a quarter of a second, it was staying off. So I changed that, and I kept having the issue, but then I rebooted both, and then the issue just went away. I don't know if it was some weird bug between 2 virtual pfSense routers or what was happening. I would like to figure that out, but for now it's working. I'm not having any ill effects. I'm not seeing any weird traffic, so I don't think it's just flooding traffic to my router 1. So we can move on. For the networking cards, the Emulex card works great. I have port 0 pass through to TrueNAS scale, and port 1 is for the ProxMox host itself. Now, I'm having a weird issue with a plugin for ProxMox that I'm using, which is ZFS over iSCSI. I'm in talks with the developer right now, and he's trying to give me a hand to get this working correctly. The reason I want to use this is because when I create a virtual machine, it will let me create a custom size disk for the virtual machine, and then I can have many instead of right now where it just presents as one big LUN on the iSCSI share. Now, onto the Netis wireless card. It's old. I should have checked it, and I should have known by the 300 megabits per second. I just thought it was a discount value card and not that old. It was actually last updated for Windows 8.1 back in July of 2014. I didn't let that stop me from testing it, however, and I have tried passing it through to Windows, Debian, and Ubuntu VMs, all with no luck. In Windows, it saw no wireless networks at all, even though I have 3 running in my home. The third one is for testing. It saw none of them. Debian and Ubuntu, however, could see the SSID, but could not connect or anything. And just to be sure, I tried to connect to my home network because I have DHCP enabled there. I do it on my Homelab, and still it would not connect and pull an IP address. I'm either going to pick up a more recent card, or I'm going to use a USB Wi-Fi adapter and pass it through to the virtual machine, which could be beneficial to me because then I can add another Intel 4-port NIC and have more to play with for virtual machines. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I have TrueNAS scale set up. To that, I have the HBA pass through, and all 6 drives, hard drives, show up to the virtual machine, and the 7th drive, which is that SSD. I put all 6 drives in a RAID Z2, and the SSD is being used as cache. So that is configured correctly, so hopefully when I get this ZFS over iSCSI issue working, it'll be fine. So, what's left before I'm ready to start the series? Well, I have to get the ZFS over iSCSI issue resolved. If I can't, I just have to present it as an iSCSI share, and go on TrueNAS scale and create a separate LUN for each virtual machine. And with testing, that could get very annoying unless I go through and pre-allocate a bunch of 50 gig drives or LUNs and just write over them as I wipe and reload VMs. But that's it for this video. I will be posting one more video before the Homelab to Network Engineer series. And in that video, I'll be going over my server rack, which hosts everything from my home, including my regular home production network, the networking connectivity, the Homelab devices, and everything from the top of the rack down, and we'll go over all of it. So if you would like to see that video, make sure to subscribe. And if you've stayed this long, I really appreciate it, and I hope in the future I will see you guys here. Thank you.